Okay, welcome everybody. I think we can start as others trickle in. I think this is my third webinar for the year, and I'm very happy to begin a discussion at least on the natural resources sector. As always, I'll look out for questions as I go through the presentation, and then at the end, hopefully if there's time, take some of the questions that are provided or typed in online. So part of the discussion that always ends up in sort of economic growth and even development queries and analytics inevitably revolves around the natural resources sector. It's such a sort of almost separate sector with its own dynamics and its own impact on the world economy. And as you'll see, hopefully, in turn, is driven by slightly different factors to other sectors in the world economy. So what we thought we would do as part of the Signia webinar series is actually give you an in-depth, deep dive into the natural resources sector. I'm going to do something a little bit more than just giving you, let's call it the sort of standard investment overview for the mining sector, which sort of I'll get to in section 2 of the presentation. And in fact, give you hopefully a little bit more of a foregrounding into how the sector operates, why we need metals, why we need mining products, and in fact, how they are quite crucially an element of both industrial policy, and I'll look at the US for that, but also how they've become caught up, if you like, in the sort of current trade wars between the US and China. I'll then give you, as I said, sort of a deeper dive into the sector overviews of the particular resources, both base metals, critical minerals, and precious metals, give you some of the outlook for 2024, 2025, which would probably be the standard way to think about the sector, and then give you an overview of some of the big global mining companies that are big players. So just in terms of the absolute basics, right? I don't think, at least many of us probably not in engineering or in working in the natural resources sector realize, right, how everything around us, everything that we consume and use is either from the ground, right, in the form of agriculture, right, that and then processed from there on. But in essence, either the stuff's being mined or it's being grown so that we can eat it. And this ore body, as it's called, right, this ore body, and you can see from the graphic on the left, is incredibly diverse, right? And extensive, and ranging from iron ore right through to the rare earths, which we'll talk a lot about, manganese, and so on, right? If you think of the periodic table. But also this ore body, the demand dynamics, the nature of the mining and so on, and the list of what's in need is dynamic, right? It changes and has changed over time and will change, right? As economies developed, as we'll see demographic changes come on board, technology changes, and so on. So one clear example is rare earths, right? A few decades ago, nobody even spoke about rare earths because of flat demand, right? There was no need for rare earths. So just keep in mind that almost at the core of modern day existence lies what we mine, and both in the sort of, let's say, base metals, precious metals, and rare earth sense. Just a caveat, I'm not going to be talking about oil and natural gases at all. Oil is almost a separate category. But if you didn't believe me, go and read up. I've just taken a simple graphic here of a house and a car, and you can see that every single product, whether it's pots and pans, which we know in an obvious way has copper and aluminium, right through to bicycle frames, TV transistors use gallium, air conditioners have copper in them, your car seat or your kitty litter, right, has stuff that we mine. So cat and dog food, for example, has copper sulfate, right? Some of this I found out in doing the research for this presentation, and others I sort of knew, right? But just keep in mind, look at everything around you, wherever you're sitting, and just about everything around you. And I'm looking at that, what we call the material world has products and elements that we are mining, right? That we are essentially mining. And in that sense, the value chain of every single product that you're looking at in that picture um, um, has at different points in the value chain an involvement from the natural resource sector. So what we'll do is I'll consider here going forward three categories broadly: base metals, as they're called. And so just keep in mind, those are things like aluminium, copper, zinc, nickel, and so on. Precious metals are generally considered to be gold and silver, right? And then the rare earths are, of course, the one that we're all talking about at the moment, but those are a slightly separate category, and I'll come back to them. But and if you look at the bottom graphic, that's quite deliberate, because 20, 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have iPhones or cellular phones and electrical vehicles and so on. And so in many ways, and those new products, let's call it, or products that are intensive in the green energy space, require rare earths. And so the broader point I made earlier is that as manufacturing processes change, as consumption patterns change, so the move from fixed phones to mobile phones, as technology brings on board new types of products and services, so the demand, the composition of demand, the nature of metals, base metals, precious metals, and rare earths that are required changes, right? So there's an entire sort of value chain and the dynamic which influences the value chain of that particular product, which then pivots demand and supply for resources. The other thing to keep in mind is what we call these mega trends, these long run mega trends. And in many ways, those are partly obvious, right? But the broad march of history, whether it's industrialization as we move from the steam engine to electric vehicles, but also demographics. So the rise of India and China suddenly means that the cell phone market is a billion plus bigger, all right? And so demographic changes then means as these economies grow and become richer, that the demands for these products, and therefore in the value chain for those resources that make those products, will increase. So we'll begin to see how the natural resource sector is influenced by all of these factors. But it's not as simple as pitching up with geologists and starting to dig, and hey presto, you've got a ore body that's marketable. I'll give you a little bit of a sense of what I've called the mining life cycle, but in essence, it's between 14 and 15 years, right? Essentially, as one moves to what we would consider, or what we would think of as the viable as sort of viable mining companies that we invest in, and so on. And that's a long road, right? So and in general, one can think of it as starting out by a sort of concept that there's ore bodies that may be beneath the Earth's surface, right? And that's a 4 to 5 year period where geologists are actually scanning the Earth's ore bodies, and including underwater, and looking at different samples, getting sizes that are representative of ore bodies, and essentially entering a sort of speculative period that is exploratory in nature, right? You can then move into what is called the pre-discovery phase, which is still risky. And if one is in that phase, right? So in other words, you may find that the geologists haven't found anything, but if you do get into the pre-discovery phase, you are still being speculative, right? And for those of you, the South Africans who are thinking about a company, think of Renogen. That's sort of a nice comparator for me, because in many ways, the Renogen represents this sort of diagrammatic mining life cycle. So you'll find that In the pre-discovery phase, there's still a lot of risk, still a lot of speculation, but the mining exploration becomes a little bit more serious. So you start getting serious cross sections of the ore body that are then extracted for further examination. You do, if you get through all of those phases, remember that's 7, 8 years already, right? You get to what is called the reward stage for early speculators, and that's a true discovery of a proper, feasible ore body, right? If that happens, feasibility studies need to occur, right? And then that's when the accountants and so on start getting involved, and investors start evaluating whether this ore body can actually provide them with returns. And I'll just go to and just keep in mind this graphic. But in essence, if you get to development, if I just go back, development is over here, where you've basically got this period where, sometimes there can be the high value that you thought this ore body was going to give you. You then get to the realism, which is when the investors start looking at the numbers. But then there could be a turning point, and that's the development phase. And essentially, that's the critical moment when you think you may have a proper mineral deposit that's profitable, right? So you begin, and if you get through that, you're essentially in the moment where we understand the mining company to be operable, to be profitable, and so on. And that's when you get startup and production. And not to forget that this is a finite resource, right? So you're not making iPhones, right? You're not making soccer balls. So at some point, that ore body will be depleted, right? And so with it is so does the value of the company, right? Fluctuate depending on the lifespan of the ore body. And that's a very unusual part of the natural resource sector, that you actually say, well, okay, what's the time period of this resource, and we'll value the company accordingly. But just to keep in mind that everything I've described, that's a 14, 15-year period, right? So in many ways, the way in which we think about a mining company and this process involves a long period of sort of long-run planning, a lot of uncertainty, and in an environment, and I'll talk about that later, that's highly regulated. So you can often think of situations where if the investment environment is particularly uncertain right now, you've almost secured a non-decision from a mining company for the next 10 to 15 years, potentially. So what does the actual mining itself look like? And I know this is not a sort of chemistry or engineering lesson, but I always think that if you're going to invest or you're going to think about a sector, you'd better understand a little bit of the science of it and how the sector operates. And in essence, there's sort of two types of mining production processes. There's sort of the surface and subsurface on the one hand, and then the in situ mining or leaching that I'll talk about in the next slide. But the surface mining is the one that's called open pit mining or strip mining, and that's essentially not digging big holes, if you want to think about it underground, right? So you just you're digging these massive deep holes, but you're not going underground with shafts and so on. That's, as I'll show later, probably the cheapest and the most common way in which a mine will operate if the ore body is present and easily available. And so there are a few examples in South Africa where you do get these surface mining companies. But perhaps the one, at least in our gold mining history, that we're most familiar with, if we think of ourselves as kids growing up and thinking about mines, is the subsurface mining. And that's the one on the left of this diagram, which is essentially dropping a vertical shaft into the ground and then operating through lateral tunnels, as they're called, to get to the ore body and excavate from there, right? And essentially, vehicles will move the ore that's released from the shaft, right, onto conveyor belts, right? And you've seen those conveyor belts, which carry the ore then further to the surface for processing. And so one thing just to keep in mind is that I've described what is called production thus far, right? So the production component of mining, but there's also the processing, which is equally important. And we'll talk about the global distribution, if you like, and the separation in the value chain between production and processing, right? And where that takes place also matters. I'll just put a point here about cleaner, safer vehicles, right? And improvements on the safety of mining and so on, and diesel emissions, because that's become a big issue for the mining industry, which is how to manage emissions. But the other technique is this in situ leaching, which is let's not dig holes, but let's stick a whole bunch of chemicals, right, into the ground and extract elements and others from the ground, right? And that's generally you injecting solutions into fissures or cracks into the ground that will dissolve minerals, break them up, and then you can extract them, right? Ultimately, you tend to find that the surface mining is the least complex, as you can imagine, the least costly and the easiest, right? It's essentially digging big holes into the ground, but from the surface. It's also less risky, which is not unimportant in a highly regulated sector, right? So you have less risk of lives being lost and claims on the mining industry for risky and dangerous work and so on. It's less labor intensive, but you're going to get lower quality ore and lower reserves with a shorter lifespan with all surface mining. So you can imagine, again, if you're going to invest or thinking about our listed entities on the JSE, or indeed all the big top 40 global players in mining, that's one of the things one should look at, right? One should look at the balance sheet, yes, but also try and understand the lifespan of the products that they are mining, or the ore bodies, whether it's surface or subsurface mining, and the costs involved and so on. And I'll come to a little bit about how one thinks about what I call the mental model for the natural resources sector. But as I said, it's not enough just to dig stuff up from the ground, right? So in other words, what you have to be thinking about is the processing part. So you'll find that in many cases, when the ore body is removed, there'll be, let's call it, if I put a visual to it, the pieces of gold in a rock, right? Simply put. And so that needs to be processed, right? And it can be crushed into pebble-sized pieces, can be ground into a fine powder. In some cases, heavy oils are used, right? And they're even more sophisticated. I'm not a chemist, but more sophisticated techniques that use flotation vessels and so on, right? You can imagine the chemical processes required to basically separate the valuable stuff from the rock. That's essentially what the processing involves. But there's also, in some cases with some metals, particularly base metals, purification, right? And the purification means actually moving between solid and liquid, or dissolving the ore completely, and then sort of going back in the process to turn it into a usable metal. And so you see this, for example, in what is called the LME grade copper cathodes, right? So that's the London Metal Exchange grade copper cathodes, which do require a particular form of processing to ensure that they are tradable, right? So it's a little bit like it's a Bureau of Standards version for metals. So if one thought that you just dig copper up from the ground and hey presto, you sort of give it a little bit of a wash and a crush here and there and you're ready, that's not the case, right? The processing and purification element post let's call it the production, is incredibly complex and is highly quality controlled, right? The problem, though, is in some cases it's environmentally degrading. And that's where the mining companies are, of course, facing a big showdown with the ESG lobbyists, right? And the main reason, if you want to understand it in a sort of more deliberate scientific sense, is that as you break up the stuff and as you purify and as you crush, you will generate both solid, liquid, and gaseous waste, right? And this stuff is airborne and it's going to be emitted, and it becomes a public bad, right? And this is what regulators need to control because it happens on a massive scale. In cases of gold and silver, for example, there's cyanide use, there's mercury risk with other metals. And so what used to be a dirty industry is now an industry that's almost a combination of mining companies trying to improve environmental standards, but on the other hand, also regulators at the state level in the US, but at the national levels, particularly in the EU and elsewhere, that are trying to protect the environment and therefore regulating the mining industry far more carefully. But the way to also think about the mining industry, as I said, slightly different from other industries, is also that this is a sector that involves a series of factors and considerations that are possibly slightly different from let's say manufacturing sector or perhaps even financial services. The first is regulation. So remember that in order to dig stuff up from the ground, under the ground, that country owns the stuff under the ground. So it's what we call a license-based industry, very heavily dependent on governments issuing, removing, regulating those licenses, right? And governments can do it directly, right? So in the South African context, the sort of provisioning of BEE regulations are conditional on licenses being issued and so on, or they can do it in indirect ways. So they governments start managing taxation, start imposing new taxes, removing taxes, and so on. And so for the big mining players, the regulatory environment, A, needs to be certain, B, needs to be free of corruption, and C, needs to be an engagement between a government and a leading company that is predictable and not subject to changes from one government to the next. And so one example is a large Australian miner in the copper industry stopped functioning in Zambia because in the previous regime, not the current president, but the previous president and his cabinet and the party were incredibly corrupt. And the pressure brought to bear on that copper mine owned by the Australians was too much, and they closed the mine. And so you can get those sort of, let's call it exogenous shock events, but you can also get what we have in South Africa, given the uncertainty around the regulation of mines, is a lack of investment. There's also environmental risk, as we've spoken, right? So this is both public and growing, and is a far more serious risk for the mining industry than for other industries, just because of the nature of the production process is far more emitting of the bads to the environment relative to other industries. The industry is also different because they're global price takers, right? So this is a little bit unlike the cartel you have in oil, which we're not going to talk about, but it's very much a sort of price-taking environment subject to global demand and supply factors, and something we'll talk a little bit about later. But in many ways, given the sort of cycles, the business cycles of the world economy, it tends to be a sort of feast or famine or boom bust type sector. And as I said earlier, why this sector is also different, it's a finite resource, right? And in many ways, if I look to this diagram in the previous slide, and I'll talk to it, is there's an optimization going on that's around the resource utilization rate. So this is actually an example from a published piece for a mine in China, right? A copper mine. And the optimization that was done by, I presume, the geologists and the scientists was to say, well, can you find a way that reduces your resource utilization rate but maximizes your profit, right? And they, in fact, in the paper deliberately suggest how the current operation of the copper mine was not maximizing profit subject to a lower resource utilization rate. And in fact, why is that important? Because the mining process is a sort of what we would call a multivariable maximization equation, right? And in many ways, they're trying to maximize across or optimize, if you like, across um, the given global prices that they assume going forward, the mine and specific ore body, and the deposits and the time that they think the deposits will last for, the time period, and that's all within an environment where there's some projection around the possibility of what we call exogenous shocks, and those could be mine deaths, and new regulations, and weather and so on, and other factors. So that the sort of a maximization equation for mines makes it quite a tricky business actually to get right, and dynamic and subject to change. It's also a sector where health and safety has a particularly, we all have, if I'm sitting here in an academic institution, health and safety is about the building, right, that may go on fire, but that's about it, right? But this is very serious, a very serious component of the mining industry in terms of the potential for deaths, the risky nature of going underground, sometimes, hundreds of meters, thousands in some cases. And that then means that health and safety standards sit at the core of the risk faced by mining companies. It's also what is often not recognized. It's what we call a monopsonist. So that's just the nature of mining means that you find usually in some isolated part of the world a ore deposit, and then you start and initiate a mining town. If some of you old enough like me will remember, Valcom was a mining town, right? You find an ore body and you start producing, and because you have an ore body, you become the single largest employer in that town, i.e. a monopsonist. What that does, though, is that the people in the community then become the employees at all levels, right? And then organize themselves. So it's very, very commonly a common feature of the mining industry or mining company is a strong union across the world. And that then strong union, single employer in a community that's dependent on the single employer, but the employer that's potentially inducing environmental damage, right? And then trying within that optimization problem that I've described here on the left is actually trying to manage the wage bill, makes for, and the possibility of mine deaths, makes for a very difficult and potentially toxic environment. So, but all of that then got me to thinking, well, how does one put this together as what I've called a mental model, right? And it's quite important to sort of keep in mind, firstly, just before I go to the actual mental model, the difference between oil and the other metals, right? What you tend to find is you can either get resource prices that are that move because of transitory or permanent components, right? So that's the first thing to keep in mind, and that's the cyclical nature. But why it tends to be a boom bust sector, and it's not something that's a feature of just casual observation, but actually sits in the data, is if you look at that graph on the left, which is the number of oil and metal price shocks. This is from the World Bank over the last sort of 40, 50 years. You find that oil is actually subject to fewer, that's the first bar here, fewer single events, right, of price shocks compared to all the other metals, right, whether it's the base metals or then we separate out into copper and aluminium. So in many cases, metal price shocks are more frequent, right? But then if you look, right, at the magnitude, and this is possibly where we get confused between oil and metals, the magnitude of the price shocks is lower, right? So we still have a larger number of price shocks in let's call it in mining, right? We don't have enough yet on rare metals and critical minerals. We don't have enough data, but the magnitude of the price movements is lower for metals relative to oil. Where do those price movements occur? They're clustered around major global shocks. So if you look at the 4 global recessions, and I've listed them there in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then our most recent in 2008, that's when you see metal prices collapsing. So that starts giving us a sense, right, in which short to medium term price movements are driven by things like recessions, but they're also driven, as we'll see, by things such as accidents, right? So the massive Vale accident in Brazil, you may recall, that disrupted iron ore supplies, and then suddenly you get a spike in the price because of a supply constraint. If you have conflicts, this is mainly for oil, but not singularly for oil, that are disruptive to the supply of metals, then you're going to see price shocks. Because again, remember, this is a global supply value chain that is not about making clothes in Salt River and then sending them to around the country, right? This is about moving copper mined in Peru, right? Right through possibly to China, right? So if an event occurs in that anywhere in that supply chain regionally, it could disrupt the supply of that metal. But you also get what are very clearly permanent shocks, which again adds to the layer of complexity in trying to understand the sector. And the permanent shocks are the ones that we know, right? Which is technology. So the point I made right at the beginning of this presentation is, who had heard of rare earths 20 years ago, apart from the experts in natural resources, and that's to do with technology. Suddenly, this is a element that's really useful for all the attributes required for new products and services, such as lightness, the ability to cope with heat, and so on. And rare earths do that really well. The example I give you here is of shale technology that suddenly pivoted the US's dependence on oil, right, or reduced it dramatically. But that was a technological breakthrough. But you also get permanent shocks that are around new ore body discoveries. So if there's a massive shortage of rare earths, or there's a key dependence on China, as we'll talk about that later, for rare earths, but suddenly there's a massive discovery in another part of the world that's not in China, this can change, right? The supply makeup, the price, and so on of the particular metal or rare earth or critical mineral. Government policies and global demographic economic shifts are massive. I've mentioned that, but the idea that if you've got big, large markets such as China and India that are suddenly demanding, and if you go back to the picture of the house, a middle-class home is now being built for billions of people, or let's say hundreds of millions of people in these two countries, where everything from bicycles to TVs to cat litter to dog food and so on requires all these natural resources on a much bigger scale. And so that becomes a permanent positive shock to those natural resources. So that then led me to sort of settle on what I called my mental model, if you like, for thinking about the market for natural resources. And I've got 5 what I call composite variables that you need to think about, which makes it very difficult if you're an investor or just a casual follower of the sector, as many of us are. Very difficult to predict price movements, profitability, or just the general state of the sector over time. The first is the macro variable. So, of course, right, as we've discussed, when you look at metal prices and price shocks and so on, whether it's business cycles, short and long run, but also growth dynamics, so China and India's sort of expansion as key markets. Interest rates, there's some really interesting work done by Jeffrey Frankel from Harvard, where his view, and it shows up in most of his empirical work, is that there's a negative relationship between the Fed's interest rate in this case and a commodity price index that he tracks, which is the Moody's one. And that's essentially a growth story, right? So higher interest rates will reduce global demand for products and services, and therefore commodity prices come down. There are a whole series of demand side variables, right? So whether you're looking at consumer preferences that change, cross-price demand elasticities that can cause sensitivities between products and the demand changes, right, means that metals may suddenly, in the value chain, the demand for that metal may actually rise, right? And so one can think of, for example, a simple case would be the demand for cell phones starts maturing and leveling off, but the demand for smartwatches goes up dramatically, and that cross-price demand effect, if you like, starts changing, and prices of watches come down, and then that starts changing the demand for the particular inputs to make these watches. You also get financial speculators, and that's obvious. But on the supply side, there's a whole series of variables around inventory, the scarcity, so how much of the stuff is actually available underground over time, input costs, right? And that could be everything from a strike that causes wages to go up to fixed costs because, capital costs because the machinery has become expensive and so on. And then you've got things like technology and skills. Cartel production decisions are perhaps not as important and organized as in oil, but certainly a key part of certain metals where cartels may form in restricting supply to control revenue. And then you get the obvious sort of accidents and strikes that can affect resource prices. There's a whole series of political economy variables. So you could, let me just sort of preface it by saying, if you run through all my variables, you could have very high growth. China's doing well. You've got consumer preferences that are high for the particular metal you're considering. Let's say cobalt for electric vehicles. Supply side, there's no problems with scarcity. Input costs are manageable, all sorts of things, but government comes in and starts issuing a whole series of regulations that either tax the miner, that either try and remove the license or force the miner to co-invest with a government-owned co-miner and so on. So all sorts of things that can upset what looks like a really positive investment. If that's not enough, you always face idiosyncratic shocks, right? And those are weather and natural disasters. And in the mining context, this is particularly important, right? You're not able to close up the factory doors, right, if there's a tornado, right? Or if there's a flood. And so in many ways, the mining industry is probably more prone because it is, let's call it an outdoor exposed industry to weather and natural disasters. There's some really fascinating work being done globally around the impact of weather patterns as the earth is getting warmer on workers that are in exposed industries. And exposed industries are those where the workforce are outdoors, and those are mainly agriculture and mining. And so do not discount the extent to which these idiosyncratic shocks make it very difficult to continue mining. And then, of course, which we will come back to, is a really important new element around the difficulty of the mining industry currently is around trade wars, right? All wrapped up within, as you've seen, if some of you are following northern Mozambique, where there's a massive conflict brewing, potentially spilling over into a civil war if it gets really bad, but all around LNG. So mining can be a particularly toxic environment for conflict. So let's switch a little bit now from the sort of the background to thinking about mining to some of what I called earlier the sort of the three-part components or segments of this industry, which is, where the reserves are, where the production takes place, and processing. And then you could add a fourth, which is the consumption. So who's actually purchasing the stuff? And it's really important to keep in mind that global ore reserves, right, unlike oil, for example, right, are highly concentrated in a few countries. And so we've taken a few examples here, again, from World Bank data, which is drawn from World Bureau of Metal Statistics, is that if you take the 6 what are called base metals, as we've said, right? So here I've got aluminium, copper, lead, nickel, tin, and zinc. So I want you to just keep an eye on those. Those will come back in a couple of slides again. But just take a look at this, right? So for example, if you look at copper, right, which is down here, right? 23% of the known global copper reserves are in one country, namely Chile, right? So that's a key country dependence, right, for a really critical, as it turns out, for the green transition, for a really critical metal. If you add two more countries, Australia and Peru, you're sitting at just under 50% of all known copper reserves being in three countries in the world. So just think about that, right? That you've got massive concentration risk, right? It's always, we know from basic investment theory, never mind this kind of stuff, that you don't want to be sort of too concentrated in one share portfolio, let's call it, right? But if you look at even Guinea, for example, has the world's largest reserves of bauxite. So if you didn't think of Guinea as an important country, I think you may start thinking about it if you're anywhere in the value chain of producing anything that has bauxite, right? Because bauxite is critical for aluminium production. Indonesia has the world's largest nickel ore reserves, and you can go through the list, right? Australia, the world's largest lead ore reserves, and zinc, as it turns out, and China, importantly, the world's largest tin reserves. So if you run through this graphic, you'll see that each bar each metal has two sort of big bars. One is reserves and production, and that's my point, right? So the country may have the largest reserves, but there's also a question about how fast or how much of the reserves are being mined, or in this case, as they refer to it, produced by the particular country. And so in many ways, reserves distributed could also be different if you look at production distribution, right? And if you look at production distribution, there's an interesting and really crucial point about the role of China, right? And that's in my bottom comment right there, like the last bullet, right? China is actually critical, right? But doesn't necessarily have the largest share of all these metals, but large enough. But they are far outpacing many other countries in the world in terms of pace of production, or if you like, pace of mining of these metals, these base metals. And it turns out, and that's that last bullet, which is really important. China accounts for between 20 to 47% of the global production, right? That's the actual extraction, not the reserves of, as you can see there, bauxite, lead, tin, and zinc. So in many ways, China's got a very clear strategy, which is to mine as quickly as possible and as fast as possible these metals. If we move on though, right, there's what I call processing, or what is called here a refined production, which is the same thing. So remember, that's let's dig the gold up, right? But China may be digging the gold up faster than other countries that have more reserves. So that's the first thing. But you've got to process that gold or that metal. And it turns out that China's a really key refiner or processor of almost all the key base metals in the world. And so what's important is if you look at the right bar here, you'll see the production. So that's the extraction of aluminium, if I take that first set of bars. And then you've got the processing of aluminium is the red, right? And then the orange is the consumption. And this bar on the right, this bar graph on the right, is for China. And China's share of the global metal production and consumption of that particular base metal. So what do we end up with? We end up with a China that's incredibly dominant in the production and consumption of, you run through that list, everything from aluminium to lead to nickel, tin, zinc, and copper. And so in many ways, the world's share of production and consumption, right, of these base metals is a China story. So those of you who are thinking about this very quickly will see that where there's a gap between production and consumption, like in copper or in nickel, China's got to make up the difference through importing these products. And so what has happened fundamentally in the global resources sector is a transformation of global consumption away from the US. And I give one example here, where in 2000, the US was the single largest consumer of almost all those metals that you see there, except zinc, right? But now, right, currently, China's commodity expansion and consumption, because of the growth of China, is so dominant that it's the single largest consumer, right, of all the refined base metals. So we just pause there, and you've got to think about yourself as a miner, or as South Africa as a mining product exporter, or any other country, that your key market for consumption, right, will be China. So in many ways, China becomes a central story, and we'll see even more important story when you're thinking about the global mining sector. Now, in this very, very busy table on the left, I wanted to give you what I call the country view of how mining meets industrial policy, how mining meets economic needs in a very deliberate way. And this I stumbled upon in preparing this slide deck. This is a list, literally public document, you can go and find it yourself, of what is called the critical minerals list and its applications, produced by something called the US Geological Unit, right, from the US Department of Energy. And they literally, right, and you can read the quote, but they literally line up the critical minerals and look at their applications, right, that they are required for in order to produce those particular products for the US economy. And it could be for domestic use, or it could be for export. So I'll give you one example. They list cobalt as a critical mineral. You'll see here where my cursor is. And they say cobalt's required for batteries and metallurgy. Let's find a nice exotic one, right? So you've got something called holmium. So in case you think I know these, I know nothing about these elements, but holmium is really important, right? Apparently for lasers, nuclear control rods, and metallurgy. And if you run through the list, they've got everything from medical equipment through to batteries, fiber optics, defense industry needs. Let's look at the others. They've got capacitors and so on. And the idea is that the US Geological Unit will produce this list every year of what they call critical minerals. And these critical minerals are then identified as a starting point for making sure, or thinking about, where supply chain vulnerabilities may exist. And what does that mean? Well, we stick with the US Geological Unit, and they produce something called the key minerals list by major import source. This is literally an extension, as I said to you at the outset, of how access to minerals becomes an arm and instrument of industrial policy. So what they've got here, if you just look at this list, right, it says in the middle column, net import reliance as a percentage of apparent consumption. What are they referring to? They're saying, what is the US import of that particular key mineral as a share of total US consumption, right? And let's just start with the first one. Arsenic of all forms, there's 100% import dependence on arsenic by the US economy, right? And where the major, and here you can start seeing the geopolitics, where the major import sources: China, Morocco, Belgium, right? So if you are not playing nicely with China, right, the US could be in trouble in terms of arsenic supply. That's sort of the kind of key dependence that you start thinking of, how mineral supply and geopolitics starts interacting. All right. And it turns out that the US imports as a share of total US consumption of that mineral is greater than 50%, right, for at least 51 non-fuel, so non-oil mineral commodities. Those are key dependent critical minerals. So the key minerals list for the US economy is this list here. And of course, as you can imagine, this is for 2022. It could change, right? It could change from one year to the next. And so in many ways, what you end up getting to is a fundamentally interesting insight into the US's trading partners, right, in this natural resource sector. And the one I'll sort of stand on is, let's look at, so of course I want to look at South Africa, and you see here that South Africa for example, let me just find it here. Manganese is the one I like, right? So manganese, the US has 100% dependence on manganese, and I'll dig a little bit deeper into this data. 100% dependence on manganese, but there's 4 country sources for the US: Georgia, Australia, South Africa, Gabon. And I'm sure some of you are beginning to think about how trading relations then are influenced and shaped by this critical minerals list, right? And remember, they're critical minerals list because, as I described, if you remember the picture of the house, maybe the US, and I'm being facetious, can't produce any bicycles because that particular product is only made by one country that I need the rubber tires for, or the aluminium frame, whatever the case may be. But here's where it gets super interesting, is that China is one of the most dominant key countries, right, or key producing nations for the US in terms of its industrial makeup and its production makeup. So China turns out to be the key producing nation for 30 of those 50 key minerals, right, including, again, right, underline this, including the 14 lanthanides. Now, the lanthanides are those rare earths that everybody's talking about, right? And we'll come back to them. So suddenly you've got the green energy transition and the needs of rare earths all being wrapped up in a China-US relationship, right? And the geopolitics surrounding that. But it's not only about China. Turns out that there are other leading producers, and we are one of them, right? So the key US demand minerals, right, are found in Australia, South Africa, and Congo. They refer to as Congo Kinshasa, which presumably means the DRC, right? Which has 2 key minerals. So those are the countries that are dominant for the US, but you can look through this list and find the particular mineral you want, and you'll find which country is the largest producer. So let's just give you one example, right? So you may find, so it's quite detailed, and I'm giving you a quick overview, but you may find that in cobalt, the DRC is dominant. But you'll notice here that, and I'm trying to find, so if you'll notice that the Congo is over here, but they but they constitute 68% of the world's total supply of cobalt. The primary import source for the US is Norway. And so to some extent, the US import dependence keeps an eye on perhaps the difficulty of extracting. Maybe in the DRC, there's governance concerns and so on. And so they're constantly managing this tension, if you like. But it's not going away, right, for the US. So if you look at the US consumption of these key minerals, they've been increasing dramatically, right? And so if you look at the CAGR for these critical minerals, right, they've been both positive and incredibly high. Those are the blue bars here for the US going forward. And so for the Department of Energy, it's a really critical sort of component of their planning around US dependence on these commodities. So which are the key economies in the world where for the US, right? So this is from the US perspective, that they need these key minerals, and you can see the countries, right? In red, it's China and Canada. So Canada is fine, but China sits at the top of the list, right? In that it's the leading US source for imported minerals commodities, right? It has 26 minerals commodities where the US relies on those commodities for more than 50% of its total import requirement, right? So that then makes a China, and in particular, I'm sort of setting up as a China-US, but it also means on the South Africa side and possibly Mexico and Brazil, that geopolitical considerations are also wrapped up in terms of these key minerals that the US needs. I found this incredibly powerful and interesting, what I called how science, economic policy, and economic growth imperatives are aligned. This, as you all may know from matric, is the periodic table, or some of you may know. But what they've done in here is in the blue bars that you see in each of the element squares, is to actually show the extent of import reliance over time. So over the period 2002 to 2022, the more dark blue you see, right, the greater the US import dependence is on that particular element or metal. And I've pointed the arrow to the rare earths, right? The rare earths are sitting in this lanthanides elements of the table, right? And you can see this massive import dependence over the 20-year period for the US. But it's just an incredibly interesting way to think about how the US thinks of its minerals dependence. I presume other countries do it. I'm not sure if they do it in as organized a fashion. But we've spoken about rare earths, so let's just quickly give you a quick, let's quickly give you a little sort of tutorial on rare earths. So what are they? They're the group of 15 elements, as I've said, in that periodic table. They're part of the lanthanide series. You do get what I call light rare earths and heavy rare earths, right? And those are the different elements there. But why they become important is because, as I alluded to earlier, they turn out to be very important for enabling products that are using technologies that require the particular product not to heat up, for example, to be durable, right, to work fast. If you think of iPhones and computers and laptops and so on, and they facilitate, the rare earths facilitate that performance much better than traditional metals. They are more reactive, so they react with other metallic and non-metallic elements. And the reason they're called rare earths is simply because they are scarce, right? So they actually in small quantities are available everywhere in the Earth's crust, but in large quantities are quite rare. And so the idea of them being called rare earths is because they are very seldom present in large forms or large bodies. So where are they found? And you can begin to see, you've got the pictorial there on the left, but they essentially, a single smartphone has approximately 8 different rare earth materials. You've got rare earths using cerium that make cars greener, right? Even more so than catalytic converters and elsewhere, right? So you've got a magnetic substance such as neodymium. That's also a rare earth, and you can imagine why that becomes important in things like MRI machines and so on. But the US, of course, is not asleep on this. And if you look at the Department of Energy, and I'm sure the EU as well, they are super focused on securing a steady supply of rare earths. If you look at the products that are required, the new tech products and so on, as well as products for the green transition, you better make sure that you have a supply, right? And they talk about high supply risk and the importance to the energy transition. And things like lithium, uranium, and so on, magnesium, platinum are low risk. So think of platinum as South Africa, but critical for the energy transition. However, equally critical are these rare earths, but they view them as high risk in terms of supply. And we'll come through why that's the case. So if you continue on the core challenge around sort of a green energy transition, right, is the green transition and the needs of the new sort of technology path, the fourth industrial revolution, and the products and services we're consuming are heavily dependent on rare earths. So rare earths are the new gold, right? That's what they are. They're the new oil. They're the new diamonds. But there's a critical sort of supply concern or supply fact to keep in mind is that China possesses over 80% of the world's rare earth deposits. And they account for over 80% of the world's rare earths refining. Okay, so you've got this massive concentration there of China's production and processing. This is not, this is an evolving story, right? So you do have increased mining of rare earths because this is fairly new, right? Outside of China. And so some of the key economies they have listed include the US itself, Thailand, Australia, and Myanmar. So let's now turn, I'm just aware of the time. Let's turn to taking you through the resources sector in review. So in other words, just giving you a bit of a sense of what the developments look like across the sectors. There's a little bit more typical investment overview of base metals, precious metals, and rare earths, to give you a sense of the outlook for 2024 and possibly 2025. So if we look at overall metals demand, you can see that the story is around China, right? And it has been over the last 2 to 3 years. So outside of China, you've got high borrowing costs, you've got low growth in the EU, that's almost sclerotic for countries like the UK and so on. And that's essentially reducing demand for metals, right? More specifically, you've got a slowdown in building construction, right? Both from high interest rates and just a general growth malaise in Europe. That's going to dampen demand for some of the metals. The counter-cyclical effect, if you like, from this growth malaise is the renewed interest and demand for everything that's green. And that could be from EV production to infrastructure builds, or in some cases, new building that needs to occur to abide by EU green standards, for example. So there is that counter-cyclical effect coming through from the move to greener products. So despite in China, you've got the problem there around construction is the real estate sector is very, very weak. But in China as well, you've got some growth in manufacturing, including in EVs, that's actually driving some of metals demand and prices up. So if we run through the specifics of some of the metals, let's go through aluminium. Aluminium, I always like to remind people what it's required for. So aluminium, in part, is found in EVs, right? Renewable power and electric grid infrastructure and so on. So you can imagine, right? Prices with growth will rebound in 2025, right? As you see demand for in the renewable sector starts increasing. Copper is interesting because it starts talking to a different element of how you need to think about in terms of, if you imagine my mental model, right? How you need to think about copper is even though you've got weakening global demand, right? That's the sort of growth story. You've also seen an increase in supply, right? So this is this uncertain factor around the sector, right? So suddenly you've got these startups and new deposits found in countries like Chile, the DRC, and I've listed them there, Uzbekistan, and so on. And so in many ways, you've got increasing supply in copper that may serve to depress prices. Lead prices are driven, if you want to think about lead, think of batteries for cars, right? And so that's the lead acid batteries where the demand is driven by. And that for me is just a useful hook, right? To think about, well, so to some extent, the replacement for auto batteries is sort of a constant demand, if you like. But on the other hand, you've got these structural headwinds, which is the move away from lead acid batteries towards lithium batteries, the growth of EVs and so on, means that the outlook for lead is a little bit uncertain. In terms of nickel, prices are expected to drop, right, in 2024 as production, and there's the supply effect, right? Production in Indonesia and Philippines actually grows. So you've got new capacity coming on stream, giving you a surplus, right? And you see these short positions on nickel being so large, right? Is because of the projected surplus of class 2 nickel with the new capacity, particularly in Indonesia, but to some extent also in China coming on stream. And so the concerns are about oversupply of nickel, and that's then going to drive prices down. So if we look at tin and zinc, again, tin is a key component of electronic manufacturers, right? So it sits in all our laptops and cell phones in some form, right? In some quantity. But here's an opposite effect on the supply side, right? There was a closure of a key mine in Myanmar, right? And that's impacted on China's raw material supply of tin, right? And so you can imagine what that's going to do to both tin prices and tin demand outside of China. On the zinc side, you've got slowing industrial activity in China, which then has reduced the demand for zinc. Remember, zinc is used to galvanize steel for construction and manufacturing. So, in many ways on the upstream side, you just need to look at where the downstream requirement is. So if it's in construction and manufacturing, and in China it's struggling, we know construction in particular, manufacturing, there are a few green shoots, but they're struggling. That means zinc is in trouble. And so in many ways, that's then overlaid by the European smelters that have not recovered, right? Following the high energy costs in 2022 from the Ukrainian war. So they've not recovered yet. And then you've had adverse weather effects. Remember the mental model. So you've got weather shocks coming through for zinc as well. And so all of that coming together means a decline for this year and a possible increase through recovering global demand in 2025. So what about critical minerals? So this is the interesting one, right? So we've sort of built them up as the future and the future of mining and so on. Yes, but in the short run, right, they are struggling, right? So, heavily influenced, I'll come back to this, by geopolitical tensions. But in 2023, what you saw in the third quarter, for example, is the essential minerals like your lithiums and your cobalt and the other rare earths, right, continue to decline. And that's essentially because growth has stalled, right? But the counter is that you've got this long run structural change in the global economy, which is towards a green transition and towards technology intensive products. And that's going to mean that your rare earths are definitely your sort of long run bet, if you like. So if I had to put money on them, long money, let's put it that way. I'm not giving investment advice, but my personal view is if you wanted to get into the natural resources sector for a long-term bet, I would look at those companies that are intensive in the ownership of rare earth metals and minerals. If you're looking at how the sort of structural factors that are driving metals, as I've alluded to already, you've got this substantial investment hike, right? And you can see it there on the left chart, right? That clean energy investment globally has risen dramatically, right? And you can see even just over the last 3 years how, in the sort of 2015, 2018 period, it plateaus, it's high, and then it just suddenly starts hiking up. So the pressure is building up, if you like, globally, both from world leaders right through to communities, right through to companies to actually switch to clean energy. And so the investment that's come with that has been seen in things like battery storage, EVs, and renewable power, and so on. And we've seen it in South Africa, of course, right? Forced on by load shedding, but in essence, we're moving to a far higher adoption of renewable technology, and with that comes an investment in things like solar panels and things like that. But do not think that if you're using renewable energy products, that they are necessarily not ESG tainted. And so what we do find is that the mining of rare earths that are very common, mining of rare earths commonly have similar ESG challenges. So what is at the end of the value chain a clean product that one is consuming may have what is called an ecological footprint that's quite dirty. And so I'll give an example there, for example, where mining rare earth elements are linked to deforestation and the usual environmental contamination, right? Due to this in situ mining, chemical usage and extraction, or you get water intensive lithium extraction, which leads to water depletion amongst communities and so on. So do not think that the final consumption of a green product doesn't have a value chain that is ESG dirty, if you like, or environmentally dirty. But the other layer in the critical mineral space, as I've described, but I'm giving you a little bit more detail, is the China-US standoff, right? How does that play out? Well, in July, give you two examples. July 2023, perhaps less well known than the second one, the Chinese government institutes a policy requiring export licenses, right, for gallium and germanium, which are the metals vital for sectors like green energy, digital technology, and defense. So just think about that. You have to get an export license from the government before you can export this particular product. And it's absolutely vital for what is most likely to be a US company. That sounds to me very much like a trade barrier and geopolitics. The US, of course, has responded or did respond with the US Inflation Reduction Act, which is well known, and that explicitly encourages the domestic sourcing of EVs, right? And imposes the procurement of necessary products and services from selected trade partners, of which, of course, China is not one of them. And so there's a whole lot of geopolitical tension that's going on between the US and China that's leading to what is called in the literature trade fragmentation or deglobalization. And in many ways, the green energy transition sits at the center of this standoff, if you like, between the US and China. So as I run through the product list and metals list and the outlook, gold prices, there's expectations for higher, for longer interest rates, as we know, and the gold prices have fallen as a consequence. You generally find that gold holdings, sorry, I have to rush through all of this, but because we're running out of time, gold holdings in ETFs actually fell in the third quarter of 2023. But remember, gold is a strange sort of store of value against disruption. And so gold prices are both likely to increase as investors shift to gold with disruption, right? Particularly in the Middle East currently, but any other sort of geopolitical uncertainty around the world, and the Ukrainian war is another example. But the other thing that's happened around geopolitics is the sanctions against Russia have meant that central banks around the world, like China, like Poland, Turkey, and India, have actually increased their stock of gold following the sanctions placed by the US on Russian assets. Suddenly, central banks and the governments are thinking, hang on, we better find an asset in case we are also sanctioned by the US. And so that's fueled gold prices going forward. Silver, again, just remind ourselves, is for EVs, solar photovoltaic products, so the solar panels, electrical components, and so on. So that's what silver is there for. And so we backpedal that's what's the demand. As long as we see an increase in the demand for renewables-based products in that space, silver demand will go up. The forecast, even though silver is expected to remain constant in 2024, is to fall actually in 2025 as economic recovery ensues. I wanted to spend a little bit of time, maybe 2-3 slides, on coal, because often coal is the forgotten natural resource, and it's viewed as, well, it's the old commodity. And interestingly, as I end off in this 2-3 slide overview on coal, say don't write off coal that quickly. So what you find is when that in the short run, so firstly, I've looked at coal for South Africa and Australia. We're not the only two producers, but we're quite key, is that you do see coal prices falling recently, but in fact spiking quite dramatically during the Ukrainian war, right? And during periods when, as we'll see, when you have heavy weather shocks and so on. But in the current environment, the drop in prices were related to declining natural gas prices and high EU emission trading system allowance prices coming through. So high trade barriers and green standards from the EU meant that coal prices effectively went up. But the demand for coal goes up in periods when you see natural gas prices spiking. The other thing that's going to happen to coal, right? Even though the forecast is to fall right through to 24 and 2025, is that it is going to remain above the 2015-2019 average. But consumption is going to shift towards China and India, right? And away from the OECD. So what you've got is a market for coal that's shifting away from advanced countries where green standards are taking hold towards sort of your China and India type countries where green standards are not as strict. And so what we find is that coal production will exceed consumption, right? With the strongest growth in the three largest producers being China, India, and Indonesia, and sustained production in high-cost countries that'll support these coal prices. But ultimately, the forecast assumes that international coal trade will remain strong despite sanctions on coal from Russia. What is it that affects coal going forward? And for me, there's sort of two key countervailing trends. One is the weather and climatic events. I think it's not often appreciated that during heat waves, as in spikes of temperatures, when you need support to the grid, so in other words, the current energy supply you have is not sufficient, people and countries turn to coal, right? And effectively, you saw that in Australia, for example, in 2022, despite all green energy policies and so on, people still need to remain cool with air conditioners running during a massive heat wave. And the only way to do that quickly and ramp it up cheaply is through coal. And so, so you can imagine things like frequent droughts as well, which severely constrain electricity generation from hydropower, lead to greater demand for coal, right? And so coal starts becoming the filler, right? The quick gap filler arising from extreme movements in temperatures or short-term spiking demand for particular forms of energy. And so that means that one needs to think very, very carefully about assuming coal away from any kind of mining suite. You may have a personal view on coal being dirty, but just as a pure sort of economic reasoning argument. Of course, what's countering coal is climate policy. So you've got coal being rapidly removed out of any kind of energy provisioning story in advanced countries, and the switch to renewables, of course, and then natural gas. And you're finding that in the big players, China and the US. So that's a countervailing fact. But as I say, ultimately, if you find a situation where there's extreme movements, right, in temperatures or weather shocks like droughts, countries may want to fill in their energy needs in the short run by using coal. And why is that important? Well, you've got a data fact here that in 2022, coal was the biggest revenue generator in mining. So just think about that. In 2022, coal was the biggest revenue generator in mining, right? And so in many ways, and I'll show this in a graphic, in many ways, don't write off coal. And you see that. As I move to global companies, and I'm near the end of the presentation, as I move to global mining companies and the top 40 in particular, look at the bottom graph on the left, and you see that the two biggest earners, right? So 2022, it was coal first, right? But coal's been the second largest or the largest earner over the last 3 years that we have data for the top 40 mining companies in the world. Just think about that, right? So along with copper. So the extent to which one thinks about coal as the forgotten ore body, I think needs to be revised. So you've got the top 40 companies going forward that have slightly lower EBITDA margins, right? But very strong balance sheets. So if you look at debt carrying on balance sheets of the top 40 mining companies, they have very little. And so in fact, the tough economic environment and elevated interest rates are not really a factor for the broad sector in the top 40 sense. So especially if you're looking at a sort of combined product with in the natural resource sector, high interest rates are not going to be important. Exploration spending is actually gone up. So you've got massive interest in going out there and searching and spending, particularly for the green energy transition. So the miners are looking at critical minerals and resources, so such as copper. So if any of you followed the BHP Anglo engagement, you would have noticed that the only asset that BHP were interested in was copper, right? And because they see that as the green energy play. And so it's not surprising if you look at the top 40 mining companies, most of the M&A activity has been around critical minerals, and within that, it's been around copper. And I think that's partly a country thing. So most of the critical minerals and rare earths are sitting in China, where perhaps access to those assets is much harder. So if you look at that, the value of critical mineral deals increased, right, by 150% in 2021, 2022, and accounted for 2/3 of all deal value in 2022. And so this is this forward-looking sort of critical minerals dominant M&A activity. In addition, these assets and company and the top 40s are looking at doing deals in those mining companies that have those critical minerals. They tend to favor outright ownership to partial stakes. So again, think of BHP and Anglo and the other examples in the Rio Tinto's acquisition of Turquoise Hill, or attempted. And so in many ways, the idea is trying to acquire full and dominant stakes in companies rather than bits and pieces. You also have the very interesting trend of sovereign wealth funds trying to get into direct asset ownership. For example, the UAE's sovereign wealth fund acquired a Zambian copper mine. You also have OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, looking to secure access to critical minerals through strategic partnership with miners. That's a simple statement of that is car companies want to own the cobalt mine, right? So that they have access to the critical mineral supply for batteries. And gold consolidation continues apace. And you can see the examples of deals and the metals that they acquiring. So I've just put a list of the top 40 mining companies. You'll get a copy of the slide deck, and you can just sort of eyeball them. And in any diversified investment portfolio, you should be looking at having these guys in your portfolio in some form and in some way. I would say be a little bit cleverer and look at to what extent, for the long run, their rare earths holdings dominate their total commodity focus. So as you can see there, we've got the South African companies, Anglo, Impala, Goldfields, and Sibanye-Stillwater. So a few policy developments to think about in the natural resources sector. They relate to the transition really to renewable energy sources, right? And then, of course, the critical minerals story. A lot of mining companies, and you can see on the left, are actually looking at technology methods in each of these metals that will reduce the carbon footprint of these companies, right? And so you can see that these new technologies are heavily focused, and the investments are going there to making mining much cleaner. You also need to think, though, about how China's green energy or China's growth stalling together with geopolitics, right, and the green energy transition all coming together almost as one complex interaction going forward. So you have a situation where China's growth is lackluster and stalling, right? And that's not good for resources. That's reinforced by geopolitical events in the Middle East, right? And then overlaying that is the geopolitical tensions with the US and the West increasingly, but the US and China, the West and China, but concentrated on US and China, which is trying to decouple their trade from China because of the key dependence here. All of that's wrapped up, as I said, in this push globally towards renewables, right? And possible counter-cyclical effects in the short run from gold, right? Regulation becomes key because in some cases they encourage, and in other cases they discourage the adoption of potentially of green products. So why I put this here is to give you a sense of, well, we always look at the US as a block and we think of Biden and we think of energy. Well, it turns out it's not the case, right? So if you look at all the renewables and the shift to green from the US differs by state, right? And so in many ways, it's not just about the Inflation Reduction Act, right? But it's also about states outside of the Inflation Reduction Act that are pursuing their own energy policy that includes emission reduction mandates, transition deadlines, and so on. And so energy transitions are occurring at the state level outside of the Inflation Reduction Act. And the extent to which that pushes back against this sort of, let's say, reducing demand for minerals and rare earths from China is important. So let's look at the EU, for example. So the EU passes something called the Critical Raw Minerals Materials Act, right? Which mandates, think about this, mandates a phased reduction in China-sourced critical minerals, right? Canada and Australia have each drawn up critical mineral strategies to support domestic production and limit China-linked companies, right, from owning critical mineral mines in their countries. So what you've got is effectively a sort of walls going up in terms of preventing China from either expanding its role and production in rare earths or limiting sourcing rare earths from China. That means that some resource-rich countries are keen to tap into both the EU and US supply origin targeted requirements, right? And then remaining open to investment from China. And so what's ending up happening is that you're seeing rare earths and other materials coming into the US and EU via third countries. And I think that's all beginning to play out at the country level and at the regional level. You even have France. So just give you one final example. France is reviewing its EV subsidies to potentially exclude China-made cars, right? The EU announces an anti-subsidy investigation into China's EV exports, right? So any consequence from this investigation, right, will in other words, and prevents Chinese imports from coming in, effectively leads to price increases for electric vehicles. And so those are the kinds of consequences you have with sort of trade war that's got an anti-China bias, right? So does it become a full-blown global trade war? There's a moderate probability, says The Economist, but of course with a high impact if it happens. But, just to repeat what I've said, you've got this crazy, not this crazy, but you've got this fractious building tension between the West is rolling out these clean energy incentives, right, to boost domestic industrial capacity and compete with China. But China is the leader in the production of many of these green technologies and cheaper, right? And so you then have this tension going on between the EU and the US on the one hand, and sometimes between the EU and the US, but China on the other side, where China holds the cards, because China holds the critical minerals and the deposits, and it processes them, right? And if the EU and the US block them, they either face a full-scale trade war in which production breaks down because you can't access the materials, or if they find alternative supplies, chances are the prices will be much higher, and consumers then do not benefit. China could, of course, react first and retaliate completely and block exports of raw materials, right? So critical for a green transition. Then suddenly decarbonization becomes more expensive and maybe even stalls for developed countries. And then there's a public good effect for all of us as the transition to green technologies and green energy actually slows down. So you can begin to see how the sort of China, US, EU trade war and trade fragmentation, all concentrated around rare earths, has a tremendous, unfortunate potential to spill over. And so that's something to keep in mind. So my final slide, before I just take a few questions, is just one slide on South Africa. We've been struggling. If you look on the left, the top graph, you've got a mining sector that reports its first revenue decline since 2015. Employment's contracted, that's the bottom bar, in mining, which in the long run used to be a key employer in South Africa, but is no longer. But it's partly wage demands and unions to some extent, but I think also to do with the type of mining that's become very capital intensive, and crucially though, constraints that include the collapse in energy, water, and transport infrastructure, labor unrest in some of the key mining areas, work stoppages due to health and safety, and then, of course, the regulatory uncertainty that's brought to bear by the relevant government department that has basically just stalled investment in the mining sector. Okay, I think I've given you a whole host of things to consider, and I don't think I have any questions which require answering, except for one, which is from an investor's point of view, when do you think we will see a turnaround in the resources sector? The returns were negative, given the structural problems we're experiencing in South Africa. Do you think the return of the profit cycle is imminent? So if we just go back to the first principles, the profit cycles. So again, first rule, look at what metal, what base metal or precious metal, or what's being mined in the company that you're looking at. That's what I would say. Firstly. Secondly, look at the underlying fundamentals. Are they driven by global growth and demand? How sensitive are they to weather? The interest rate cycle, macro, think of that macro mental model of mine. And then you can answer that question more accurately. In general, I would expect an uptick in economic activity in 2025, which should be driven by a stronger China, right, which is difficult to see at the moment, but certainly the US is giving us for continued growth into 2025, and the push to green energy is when you're going to see the turnaround. But that also depends on whether the company you're looking at or the stock you're looking at is orientated towards growing sectors like in the renewable sector and green buildings and so on. Okay. So the question is around wages. So regulatory uncertainty, definitely an issue. So it's not that wages. So the question is, why are wages an issue in South Africa, but not Australia and Canada? So again, I'd need to look at purchasing power parity wage levels, but certainly if you look at relative costs, so wages as a cost of total production, that's the key metric. That together with high incidence of disruption. So if you look at strikes and so on, they may be higher in South Africa. And those would be a factor relative to, say, in Australia and Canada. The other thing is we may be less capital intensive than in Australia and Canada, which allows them to shift away much of the union burden or the union concerns around organized work relative to South Africa. But a good question. It's worth digging a bit deeper. And it may also be the type of mining, right? So South Africa's gold mining is particularly capital intensive, which allows less adoption of work, but it's also more dangerous, and so on. Yeah. Will the advent of AI have a material impact on the investment case for mining? That's a super interesting question. I don't have anything clever to say, except that if you're thinking about AI and its possibility to improve the efficiency of search around minerals deposits, the efficiency of predicting um, the lifespan of mines, right, with proper data, with more careful modeling, then I think AI has a role to play. I don't think there's been full enough adoption of AI in the resource sector in that way, right? If you think of the optimization problems that define mining balance sheets, I think AI definitely has a role to play. Okay, so I'm going to, oh, there's lots of questions coming in. All right. Is China's demand for metals and minerals not, it says not normalized. So I'm not sure what that means. As its industrialization reaches levels in the West, over what period? Oh, I see. So that's a good question. So the point here from Mark, I think it is, well, China's in this sort of very high growth phase. And so there's this voracious demand for metals and minerals. And won't that normalize? That's a great point. I think to some extent, yes, that's sort of probably more uh, I would say, a 10 to 15-year period, because China's still going through the throes of being a middle income country, right? So there's still um, infrastructure needs, energy needs are still massive, right? Of course, that's the growth story. But just remember, as a sort of in an absolute level, it's still going to remain very high just because of the population size of China. I think the short run is the worry. So that old sort of housing driven, remember China's latter days, so more recent recovery has been not through China's growth latterly has been less through manufacturing exports and more through infrastructure, of which housing has been a key part, but that's collapsed. So I think in the short run, that's the real challenge, right? Is where will metals and minerals demand come from? It certainly doesn't seem like it's going to be China's housing market, right? And so we either rely on China's recovery through manufacturing and elsewhere, um, or just sort of an absolute tick up from China's growth in small levels, but because of the quantum, could shift the dial on demand for metals and minerals. But I think just to go back to it, I would really, if you're looking at stocks and you're looking at investment cases, I would look under the hood of these top 40s and ask, okay, are they, what are the metals and minerals they own? And then do a deep dive into where the demand is for those particular products, and what that looks like. So if they're a heavy owner in lead, for example, I'd be very worried about that company, just because lead's going nowhere and the demand at this stage doesn't seem to be there. Okay. All right. I think we've run out of questions, but thank you very much, everybody. The Signia team tells me that the presentation will be made available to you afterwards. And yeah, please email me. I have a public email if you have any questions or comments. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good day further.